Rob Dunn. I'm the Senior Vice Provost for University Interdisciplinary Programs. And I'll be asking some of the questions tonight and framing some of the discussion. And what we want to do today is to talk about where we are with transgenic food, GE food, but also talk a little bit about the future. And I think we have a really amazing opportunity here at NC State because we have the world's leading group in thinking about transgenic organisms in society. And so we have a group that can really help us talk through am I competing with myself? Sorry about that. And so to think through some of these ideas and questions, and some of the conversation will be prompted by the tasting you did on the way in. I think one thing to acknowledge as we enter into this conversation is that you are, from a cellular perspective, largely transgenic. In that, if you think about the corn you've ingested, so if you think about your body, most of the carbon in your body, more than 60%, 70% in some cases, comes from corn. And much of that corn that you've ingested is transgenic. And so your average cell is actually relatively transgenic. And so if you think about it, your own position relative to the story, every time you eat candy, every time you eat corn syrup, you're engaged in this story in this really interesting and very bodily way. And so in some ways, the cornbread out there that was corn muffin A, they're both gone. I wanted to have a prop, but they appear to have both been delicious. That's probably, for most people, the less common scenario, that you're eating the non-transgenic corn muffin. And so that's the novel taste in some ways. And so I think that's sort of an interesting context as we embark on this broader conversation. So what I'm going to do now is to just have our panel walk through both who they are, what their role is at NC State, and sort of how they came into their work, what that trajectory was from undergraduate student to the strange things they do now. And we'll start with Jason Delborne here, right to my left to my right, left to my right, right on my left. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. So my name is Jason Delborne, and I am a professor in forestry and environmental resources over in the College of Natural Resources. But I came to NC State in 2013 to join the Genetic Engineering and Society Center. And I also have a role here in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm the director of the Science, Technology, and Society program, which is an undergraduate major. Any STS majors in the audience? Ooh, they're in trouble. So I'm a social scientist. My brief journey to this place, I have an undergraduate degree in human biology, which was very interdisciplinary. I really couldn't decide between the sciences and the social sciences. I was interested in both. And then I was an environmental activist for a number of years and found some frustrations in that world for myself that I didn't feel like I fit quite well, even though I really believed in those kinds of issues. And I went to graduate school wanting to learn to be a bridge between public communities and expert communities in thinking about policy. And so I focused on environmental policy. And I really didn't know where I was headed, but I've ended up, as a scholar, having a career in thinking about how we actually do translate public values into conversations that experts and elites at the political level can understand. And so I do work on community and stakeholder engagement, thinking about how we get public values and public conversations into the governance processes, especially around emerging technologies. And in particular, I've thought a lot about emerging biotechnologies that aren't just for agriculture, but also for environmental purposes. And I'll just say that my last few years, I've really been focused on environmental biotechnologies for conservation. So one of my interests as a social scientist is that a lot of the opposition to GMOs has come out of the environmental movement. Concerns about ecological risk, safety, things like that, and also, the negative effects of large agriculture, monoculture, things like that. But what happens when biotechnology is applied to problems that environmentalists care about, like species conservation or climate management or things like that? And so as a social scientist who's really interested in these controversies, I've been curious to investigate, and not just from a distance, but actually get involved in efforts to create technologies, biotechnologies that are designed for environmental benefit. And so a lot of my work is partnering with scientists and helping them think about the broader social and political and ethical issues around their technologies before they're ready to bring to market, so that some of those influences can be incorporated in their design.
Jason, what did you think you were going to do when you were 19?
When I was 19, I thought I might be like a management consultant, because that's what a lot of people who I knew in college were doing, and it sounded kind of exciting. Like, you get to work on a lot of different things and a lot of different projects, and it turns out that's kind of what I get to do. I get to work on a lot of different things in a lot of different ways, and for me, the reason why academia got planted in my head was that I was a teaching assistant my first year out of undergrad, and I got to look behind the curtain, basically, of what is teaching college like? What happens among the professors? And that just whet my appetite for thinking about what a privilege it would be to be a professor and to be in charge of designing what people are going to learn at a really important time in their life. So I feel really lucky to be here.
Thanks, Jason. Fred Gould?
Yeah. Well, I like this introduction about, how our lives evolve. And sometimes I've talked to students who think that if you're a professor, you must have been on the straight and narrow. You must have known when you got out of high school that you wanted to be a professor or something like that. And it turns out, I don't think in any of our cases that that's the way it goes. And I went to college during the 1960s when things were really pretty crazy, crazier than they are now. My father wanted me to become a doctor. And I went through back and forth trying to decide whether I really wanted to do this. And I actually got into medical school and then had my own crisis about what am I going to do? And I wound up dropping out, becoming a cab driver in New York City and hanging around in Europe picking grapes or whatever. I didn't know that I was ever going to do anything beyond that. And then I got tired of all that, and I heard that there were universities that would actually pay you to be a graduate student, and you could get to take classes and learn stuff, and they would pay you. And they do, and they still do. Not much, but they do. And so I decided to go to graduate school, and I didn't know I was going to go to get a PhD in the beginning. But then after a while, I got sucked into the system and started working harder and harder and harder and got going. But I was always into natural history, and what I was studying was plant-insect coevolution, from a very basic thing about biodiversity and all of that. But I later realized that I wanted to do something that would have more application. And so my thesis started working more on how plants defend themselves, crop plants defend themselves against insect pests. And that's how, after I got my PhD, I came down here for a one-year postdoc and got even more sucked into this system of trying, in an agriculture school, trying to decrease use of pesticides by breeding plants to defend themselves. And there was a problem I was working on, which was with the corn earworm that feeds on corn. And we were trying to make the corn by just finding varieties that came from different parts of Mexico and other countries to find those that would be more resistant to the insects and to stop the insects from adapting to them. And we were having a terribly hard time. And then all of a sudden comes transgenics. And we'll talk a little more about that, but there's transgenic corn that uses a gene from a bacteria that was used as an organic insecticide, but they took the one gene out of that bacteria that causes the mortality of the insect, and they put that into the corn plant. And so that's how I got involved in working on genetic engineering, because at that time I was an evolutionary biologist, my training, and our concern was they'd use it and the insects would rapidly adapt to it and we'd lose it. And so I've been involved in that for a long time, and all of this became very controversial. And over time, I realized that as a natural scientist, I didn't know how to talk about this stuff and got more involved with social scientists along the way. And slowly but surely, at NC State, we built a cluster hire. We won't go into all the details, but we were able to hire people from different perspectives to come in terms of faculty. but also got a training grant from the National Science Foundation to train students who were getting their degrees in the humanities, social science, and natural sciences to work on problems together. And that's how we all became part of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center that has grown a lot over time. And so we keep doing these things, and having worked with plants that are transgenic for a while, all of a sudden the insects that I also love became genetically engineered, and we've been working more recently on mosquitoes. And the idea, the goal there is to change the mosquitoes so either they don't transmit diseases like dengue and malaria, or that we're able to use special genetic techniques to lower the density of those to lower the disease incidences. So all of this is very controversial in society, and biologists on their own can't figure out how to deal with it. We need societal impacts, and Jason's talked about it, but I know Jennifer can introduce herself and talk about
Yeah,
it.
and just quickly, Fred, two questions. First, tell people your job, and second, when did you move out of your VW van?
I never lived in a VW van. It was a bread truck.
A bread truck. All right.
Yeah, so that was the 60s. So I drove a bread truck down here. I got 2 traffic tickets within a month. Yeah, whatever. I was not exactly the usual
And your current
person.
position?
My current position, oh, I should say that, yeah, Jennifer and I are co-directors of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center. My appointment is in the Entomology and Plant Pathology Department, but I'm also the executive director of the Genetics and Genomics Academy that was just recently formed, and so in some ways, he's my boss, so I better say nice things.
You can start soon, Fred. And Jennifer Kuzma?
Great. Hi, I'm Jennifer Kuzma. I'm a professor in the School of Public and International Affairs here at NC State, and I also co-direct the Genetic Engineering and Society Center with Fred. I'm also an associate director of a new center that we're just establishing called Precision Microbiome Engineering, so we can talk about that later if you're interested about engineering the microbes in the built environment, perhaps with genetic engineering. So, well, I never lived in a bread truck, but I grew up in college in the 80s, in the mid-80s, which was an entirely different decade than the 60s, of course, you know, big hair and neon and all that kind of stuff. But it was also a really interesting decade in the sense that it was the first decade where genetic engineering was really coming into society. So at the time, the ICE- bacterium, which was a genetically engineered bacterium, was being proposed to be sprayed on strawberry plants to prevent frost damage. And I, at 18, had no clue what I was going to do, absolutely none. But I did know that they were going to pay for all of my college because I got a science scholarship, a full tuition scholarship, as long as I majored in science. So I knew I had to do that. But in my undergrad, I also minored in philosophy. So I always had this kind of undercurrent of interest in the bigger questions about what is natural? Does it matter with genetic engineering if it's quote unquote natural or not? What does that mean for the world, the planet, and society and where we live? So I started out as a biochemist, actually, got my PhD in biochemistry, but I always had this underlying interest in the bigger questions about how genetic engineering fits into society. And you know, one of the quotes from Albert Einstein really sits with me a lot. Science can only ascertain what is, but beyond it, value judgments of all kinds are necessary. So in other words, we can't make a decision just based on science, but we need to also understand the value context in which the science is interpreted and deployed in society, and the larger sociocultural and economic systems in which the technology sits. But I stayed in the lab probably too long, beating my head against the wall in graduate school as a biochemist, and then beating my head against the wall as a plant molecular biologist. And I wanted to save the world with transgenic plants. And so I was working on salinity, drought tolerance in plants, and how do you make them more resistant to drought and salinity tolerance, and perhaps due to climate change. But although I really admire people who can do that lab work, it takes a really intense focus on a very specific problem for a very long time. And that was just not me. I had a little too scattered, a little too many interests. After my postdoc, I said, well, how can I do something different? I looked into patent law, not for me. Again, way too detail-oriented. And then I looked into policy, and that really attracted me. So I was a part of a fellowship where they throw scientists into Washington, D.C., and they say, do policy. You're a scientist, help us understand the science, but you do policy. And so I worked on the risk assessment for things like mad cow disease in the 1990s, risk assessments for foodborne illness like E. coli in hamburger, or E. coli H7O157, I hope I got that right, O157H7, backwards. So that was all very interesting. I got to see how science actually turns into decision-making in a regulatory agency. And how do we ensure safety, which is really socially constructed in a lot of ways, but how do we set a regulatory standard based on scientific information? And there were always value judgments and uncertainty that came into play. So to make a long story somewhat shorter, I then decided to go back, and I worked at the National Academy of Sciences for a while as a study director, and that's where I met Fred. We worked on a report on how genetically modified pest-protected plants should be regulated, a pretty controversial report. I also worked on agricultural bioterrorism for a while, right when 9/11 hit. But I heard the plane crash into the Pentagon on 9/11, 2001. I was in the building where the anthrax letters were opened. There was the DC sniper, and I thought, how do I move back to Minnesota and still do science policy? Because things are getting a little too intense around here. So I ended up being a professor at the School of Public Policy, the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, and then I started doing social science. So I kind of learned social science on my own. I now have tenure in the social sciences, which is kind of bizarre. I try to keep my PhD in biochemistry a secret, although it's no longer a secret. I'm tenured in social sciences and policy, and that's how I ended up here at the Genetic Engineering and Society Center. So I always tell my students, don't think about what you're going to do the rest of your life. Think about what you're going to do for the next 5 years, because you never know beyond that where it's going to take you. So I think I'll stop with that. Oh, now my research is on governance of genetically engineered products. And governance broadly, how do we incorporate value judgments with the science to make decisions, to make sure these are well monitored, well regulated, and that consumers have a voice and choice, whether they want to eat GMOs or not eat GMOs.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think we're going to now tip, and then Fred's going to lead us through an exercise that relates to all this.
Okay.
Not like jumping jacks, I don't think.
Okay, so now it's your turn. All right, so I got a bunch of questions for you. I'm going to show you some pictures and ask you some questions. Okay, so this is a grocery shelf. You've all seen something like this, and
They might want you to use the mic a little bit more.
in Food Lion or Harris Teeter or someplace like that. So when you go into a grocery store like this, and you're going to pick out something, how likely do you think you are to be picking out something that's been genetically engineered? Like, what percentage of these fruits do you think are genetically engineered? And I'll start you out at a low level. None of them. How many of you think none of them are genetically engineered? How many of you think that 20% are genetically engineered? How many of you think that 40% are genetically engineered? How many do you think that 80% of them are genetically engineered? And how many of you think that they're all engineered? Okay, thank you. Okay, next. All right, this is going from fruits to vegetables. So looking at this, if you walked into the grocery store, what percentage of these vegetables would you think would be genetically engineered? Let's go the other way around. Start at, well, no, let's go do the same. 0. How many say 0? How many say 10%? 40%? 60%? 90%? All of them? Okay. I just wanted to, I'll come back to this, okay? All right, now I'm going to ask you some other things. Okay, these are Cheerios, right? How many of you have never eaten Cheerios? One? Okay. I knew there's always somebody who hasn't eaten Cheerios. I always love it, right? But most people have eaten Cheerios, right? But today you can go into a store to buy Cheerios, and they used to be just Cheerios. Now there are lots of different kinds of Cheerios, right? But if you go into a store and there could be 2 packages of Cheerios, and if you look at them carefully, they have different labels on them. I'm going to stay near this mic. One of them says, not made with genetically modified ingredients, right? And the other one says, contain bioengineered food ingredients, meaning they have genetically engineered ingredients in them, okay? So if you go into the store and you saw 2 packages of Cheerios, and one said that it didn't have any GMOs, and the other one did, but it cost 15 cents more to get the one that didn't have GMOs in it. How many of you would spend the extra 15 cents? A few of you, okay. How about, I know you're all students, most of you are. How about if it was the same price? How many of you would go for the no GMO? I knew that that would change your mind. All right, watch this, okay? I'm gonna ask you about some other things, okay? This is also 2 apples. Can somebody tell me what the difference between these apples is?
They're Arctic apples, so they're not brown.
They're not brown, right? So the one that's GMO doesn't turn brown. So if you slice them up, put them in your lunch bag, take them to school, whatever it would be, they wouldn't be brown. The other one would turn brown. So the question this time is, how many of you would spend 20 cents more per pound to get apples that don't turn brown? Okay. Okay? So do you see, and if they were the same price, how many of you would go for the GMO apple? Okay, I know we're talking to students. Okay, but some of you wouldn't, even if it was the same price. Okay. Now we're going to talk about Aqua Bounty salmon. Okay, this is a genetically engineered salmon that has genes in, well, let me back up. They grow salmon, are in the wild, but they grow them in ponds. And when they grow them in ponds, they put in fish food. But in the winter, the salmon are more or less just hang out. They eat, but they're not growing, because that's how salmon are when it's very cold out. They're not going to be growing. But they put in genes into the salmon from some fish that actually live in very cold waters, and they have growth hormones that keep them growing throughout the winter. And so these genetically altered ones grow all winter, so they grow a lot bigger. And these are the same age, these 2 fish. The genetically altered ones are twice the weight. Okay. So if you go out for a fancy dinner, and you see the GMO and non-GMO salmon on the menu, and the GMO salmon is 60 cents less, how many of you would get the GMO salmon? Okay, just to ask, how many of you would not get the GMO salmon? Okay, and some of you are not sure you have an opinion. Okay, all right. But what I want you to see is not the same people are raising their hands for all of these. And I want to bring you to this next one, and this is the Enviro pig, right? How many of you think that this is a cute pig? All right, good. I think so. So pigs eat a lot of soybeans and a lot of corn, but they have a hard time digesting the soybean. And I have some slides here. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail, but they don't have the ability to digest certain phytic acid that's in the soybean, and therefore they poop it out, and it has phosphate in it, and it's a cause of pollution. Again, I'm not going to go through but the main thing is that that pig, the Enviro pig, produces something like 75% less fecal phosphorus, right? So for the environment, that's why it's called EnviroPig. It's a lot better for the environment. So this next question is, if you were going to the grocery store and there were these pork chops and it cost 20 cents more to get the ones that came from the EnviroPig, how many people would spend more to get a genetically engineered genetically engineered pork chop? So I'm assuming a lot of you would not spend the extra money. Okay, but think about that, right? This is for the environment, but it's genetic engineering. So you're having differing feelings about those different two things. So this is a last little thing to talk about. This is cheese, right? And you make cheese with rennet. So rennet curdles the milk and causes cheese to form. Some cheese is made with natural rennet, and some is made with engineered rennet. And so the question is, if you had a choice between these two, would you rather, if they were the same price, how many of you would go for the natural cheese? How many of you would get the genetically engineered cheese? A few of you, right? You like that. Well, the interesting thing is, how many people here have never eaten pizza? I don't see any hands on that one. No, you're not. Okay. Well, the thing is that in the United States, all pizza is made with engineered rennet. So you don't really have too much of a choice. But what it is that they've taken the enzyme, the gene that codes for the enzyme that curdles the milk, and moved it from an animal into a bacteria, and that's how they curdle the milk. They ferment the bacteria, and they produce this enzyme. The natural rennet comes from scrapings of the stomachs of baby calves or baby goats. So one, in some sense, is a little more humane, maybe. So I just want to give you just a sense of these genetically engineered foods. And now I want to go back to this, because we've been talking about genetically engineered foods, and Rob explained to you how most of your carbon has come from corn and so on. But the answer to that question is actually, in this thing, in terms of fruit, the answer is probably 0%. I know, that's surprising to me, that it's surprising to everybody. It seems like that. If there was a mango in here, it would be possible, but I know there are apples here, and I told you about an apple, and I'll get to that in a second. Here, there is sweet corn, and there is zucchini squash. Some small percentage of those could be genetically engineered. But probably the outside guess here would be at most 10% of what you have here is genetically engineered. And we talk about that a lot, but I hope we can use that a little bit in the discussion. And I just want to show you that they do make these special Arctic apples, but if you go to Amazon and try to buy them, they're not available. And that's because I think actually just the business model didn't work. Not enough people cared, or whatever it was, about that. And the company is still around. And I want to end with what you just ate if you came early enough, and that is pink pineapple. And I'm not sure how much the library paid for this, but as a normal person, it used to be $49, and now they've dropped the price to $39 per pineapple. So just to let you know that. But I just wanted to get this to introduce you and get you involved. And actually, Jennifer could tell you why that pineapple costs $39. You want to talk a little bit about that?
A lot of engineering went
Yeah.
into it. Yeah, so they have the gene that makes lycopene synthase. They took a gene from a tangerine and upregulated it to make more lycopene. But then in addition to that, they took short RNA sequences, short genetic sequences, to downregulate the gene that breaks down lycopene. And those came from the pineapple. So when they say, oh, this is something the pineapple does naturally, that's true. But they used a little engineering to upregulate something and downregulate something else so that the lycopene would stay there and not get converted to beta carotene. So that's why the pineapple is pink.
All right, so we'll end this part
So
here.
probably a lot of investment in the company to make that, and they're trying to recoup some of that investment now, given all the technology and all the costs that went into that. So.
Okay, so wait for me to. All right, so I guess, Rob, what's next?
Well, so we can go back to the food outside. So how many of you preferred the pink pineapple? Well, we'll see how that business model's going for the And what about the cornbread? How many preferred the organic, non-transgenic cornbread? How many preferred the transgenic cornbread? Yeah, I thought they're both pretty tasty. But just to give context, that some of these things are some of the foods we eat a lot of are transgenic. And so a relatively large proportion of your diet can be influenced by transgenic crops. But as Fred points out, that if you look at a grocery aisle of fruit or vegetables, it's a small proportion of the species.
Yeah.
And so we're in an interesting moment.
Yeah, most of the first generation of transgenic crops or GM crops, genetically modified crops, went mainly to animal feed, a lot of it, or to cornstarch or soybean meal. So a lot of the way that you're consuming GM is through cornstarch or soybean meal or oil or something, some more processed. But what's changing, Rob, if you don't mind me talking a little bit about that, is there's a lot more going on now in the fruits and vegetables area. I mean, you're seeing the apple come up, you're seeing the pineapple come up. You'll also see, mustard greens, things like that people are trying to engineer to make either tastier or healthier in some fashion. So I think that's going to change in the next 5 or so years, is that you're going to see more fresh fruits and vegetables that are either gene edited or transgenic or traditional first-generation genetic modification technology. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what else is on the horizon? How different does this look in 5 or 10 years? I presume there are things in the patent line that we can see are coming but are not yet available.
Yeah. Well, and Fred and Jason, feel free to jump in too. But things like, for example, there's a purple tomato that's been approved by USDA, but not yet approved Department of Agriculture. So it's been approved for growing in the field, but not yet approved for by FDA. And that has the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates food safety. So approved for growing, but not yet quite there for the actual consumption yet. Although FDA has a voluntary safety assessment process, it's not mandatory. But that's another whole other talk. So anyway, so it hasn't been reviewed by FDA yet. So essentially, the purpleness comes from anthocyanin production, and so it's an upregulated and an anthocyanin gene put in to make it purple as opposed to red, to increase the. And that's antioxidant properties, so it may have health benefits, for example. So I think you're going to see more things like that with health benefits because they think that that's what consumers want. But it's interesting that it may or may not be what consumers want ultimately. So.
And how has it changed through time? How expensive it is to produce these new varieties? How long it takes to go from idea to instantiation? And
you want to take that one, Fred?
Yeah,
what that looks like.
It's really interesting. I mean, that's a really complicated question in a way, because we talk about genetic engineering as if it used to be really, really hard, and now it's gotten so easy that anybody could do it in their backyard, and it's not really quite that way. But indeed, the process of genetic engineering, of crops started in the 80s, really, I would say, in any real way. And that all used a naturally occurring agrobacterium that has a life cycle where it infects a plant, and then what they did was they added to that a gene they wanted to this bacterium, and then that had a plasmid that got inserted into the plant. But now there's this new CRISPR technology. How many of you have ever heard of CRISPR? I had a feeling that would because right, because that is all the rage, and that's where Jennifer is talking about gene editing, and we can get into that, I think, a little bit more. But it's sort of like CRISPR is something that people have in their science fair projects. It's not that hard to do that with some organisms, but I think we have some plant genetic engineers here who could tell you how hard it is to actually get something that you really want into a plant. And when you're doing that, you're typically doing it in cell culture, and then you're having to raise that plant in special ways so you actually get a plant back. And that plant might look like this a little bit, right? So we might have some people in the audience answer some of these questions as well. Maybe Anna, could you tell us how, if genetic engineering has gotten a lot easier or quicker over time?
There are some species that is very easy to engineer because they have an easy process of what we call transformation, basically delivering foreign genes into the plant, that gene being integrated into the plant genome. And there are some species what we call recalcitrant transfer, very resistant to transformation. So the problem is usually with the resistance of a particular genotype with accepting foreign DNA. So a lot of crops are recalcitrant. It's very hard to transform, very hard to make them into GMOs. So something like tomato is easy to transform. Tobacco is easy to transform. But then something like soybean is a little bit more complicated. There are only specific varieties of cotton that can be transformed. So it depends very much on the species.
Yeah. Are we getting at your question a little bit?
for
or you
sure.
wanna-
Yeah, Jason?
And just, Fred mentioned this before, but I want to call attention to it. Another kind of new wrinkle on the horizon is that when we think about genetic engineering in food, we think about genetically engineering our food, right? But what if we instead genetically engineer the pests themselves instead of the food? So there's a pest called the spotted-winged Drosophila, which wreaks havoc on berries and cherries and some other different kinds of produce. And it's been really hard to manage with traditional insecticides. And so some scientists are asking questions about, could we use what's called genetic biocontrol or genetic methods to make a GM insect, a GM spotted-winged Drosophila, that would then change the population of insects out there that aren't under our immediate control. And if we did that, what would that mean for the way we think about our food? So if your berries weren't themselves transgenic, they're not GM raspberries, but the way that they've stayed healthy and full and non-damaged is because we have genetically engineered pests around them, and maybe some parts of genetically engineered pests end up in your berries because that happens. How do we think about that in terms of our relationship to GMOs if we're not purposely ingesting them, but they're out in the environment? Are we more comfortable with that? Is that exciting because the food that we eat isn't GM? Do we have additional or new kinds of concerns because the GM is no longer under our control in our agricultural field, but out in the environment and potentially spreading well beyond the agricultural fields and into unmanaged environments? So that's another kind of wrinkle of the way that people are thinking about using genetic engineering around our food systems that's really different than what was imagined in the 80s and 90s.
Can you, sort of following on that a little bit, can you talk a little bit about how the ownership of these organisms has changed? And I think the first generation were, almost exclusively owned by big ag companies. What does that look like now? Is that changing?
Yeah, there's some evidence that there's a greater diversity of smaller companies and academic developers than the larger companies like Bayer, Monsanto, or now Bayer, but Monsanto, Syngenta, those companies. So it looks like things are getting a bit more diverse. There's some small companies in the Triangle region here in Raleigh. Pairwise is a gene editing company. They're working on healthier like greens and berries and things like that. So I think that's true. I still think you're going to see a lot of activity from larger companies, but there have been a few articles that have looked at the diversity both in the number of products and in the types of organizations bringing those to market, or at least having some role in the pipeline to bring them to market. And it seems to be getting a bit more diversified in that regard. So in some ways that makes people feel much more comfortable, because one of the biggest factors of public perception is lack of trust. Lack of trust in large corporations and ownership of the food supply, and I think is a big factor in how people perceive GMO. A lot of people perceive GM foods. And so perhaps with a greater diversity, but you still, there is a huge trust component still there, though, regardless of the developer of the technology.
Rob, I thought maybe it would be worth it for us to bring up, we've been talking about transgenic crops and also gene editing. And I think that the differences between them are not so clear to everybody. So I'm going to just start off with this, and please add in. But the earliest crops that were being developed by these large corporations were using the technology of the time. And the technology was invented somewhere in the 70s. Mary Del Chilton, who was in this area, and her husband worked at NC State, was really the first person, would you say that, Jose and Anna? Yeah, to do this, and to actually be able to use that agrobacterium to transform a plant. And what that was doing was typically bringing foreign genes into a plant, foreign in the sense that it wasn't from the same species. So you're putting two species together, genes together that hadn't been together in millions and millions of years, right? So it was like this big thing that you were doing, and that's how transgenics started. And the regulations on those things were all about the fact that, wow, this is so weird and new. How can we trust that this thing actually wouldn't cause some new risk? It wouldn't go wild and take off and, you know, be in natural environments or something else, or poison you, right? How did we know that wouldn't happen? And over time, of course, there's been very strong regulation on those kind of crops that are produced that way. But recently, with the advent of the ability to do this gene editing, what you're doing is not bringing in a gene from outside the gene pool of that species, but rather manipulating within that gene pool. So maybe you're changing some nucleotide base pairs, right, little tiny tweaks, and that's why it's called editing. But indeed, you can use that same CRISPR technology to bring in big chunks of genes or all of that. But a big thing that we talk about, or at least I know I talk about, is it's the change that you make that's something that we really have to pay attention to. But from the regulatory stance, the difference between those is big in terms of how much it costs to go through the regulation. But you folks could speak much more to that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just to clarify, with gene editing, at some point you may be using transgenes or foreign genes to make the edit, but then what developers of these products are doing is they're back-crossing them out. So then you may just be left with a change that is already found in the species already. And so we call that cisgenic, meaning coming from the same species. So a lot of gene-edited products will be that. But there will be some that use CRISPR technology where the foreign genes or the genes from a different species are left in. So I think it's super confusing to the public to explain the difference between gene editing and, you know, transgenics and first-generation GMOs. But I think Fred's point of the risk doesn't, we haven't mentioned this yet, but there's been a long-standing assumption that the risk of any conventionally bred product or organic product would be the same as an engineered product. It's going to depend, like as a category. The risks, one conventionally bred product could be riskier than a particular other transgenic product. But each product has a different you would need an assessment. So as a category, the National Academy of Sciences has had a longstanding view that the risks are the same in kind between conventionally bred products and transgenic products and gene-edited products and whatever else. It's really the specific product that matters, not the process by which it was created. That's sort of what our regulatory system is kind of premised upon. Although we do take a special look at biotechnology products, given their novelty and lack of, perhaps in many cases, a history of safe use. So it's yeah, sorry if that was a little complicated, but it's kind of complicated.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing before we go into questions. And that's, so, you know, as a social scientist, I'm really interested in the way that people talk about these technologies. And so something that I would urge you to pay attention to is when you hear people talking about the safety or the danger of GMOs, really pay attention to the kind of language that they're using, and the kind of analogies that they use, and the kind of fact-based claims that they use. So there's some really, you know, interesting ways to talk about gene editing that make it sound really safe. One of the things you'll hear a lot of scientists say is, well, we're doing gene editing and this could have happened naturally.
Yeah.
It's an interesting claim. That is a scientific claim, but it's also a claim designed to make you feel and think in a particular way. And I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but I think it's really important to recognize that these debates and the way that we think about it from a social or political perspective is not just about the facts and the way that we measure risk. It's also about the way that we're taught to think about this, the kinds of narratives or imaginations that we have around these processes and what they mean for us in terms of our bodies, our environments, our children, our future. These kinds of things really matter.
Thanks, Jason. So I think we can now tip to questions if folks have any questions for the panel. Yeah.
That's okay.
No, it's perfect.
I was just wondering, when you say risks, what, like, the risks are the same, what are the risks in what sense?
Yeah, that's a really great question because what we care about and what kinds of harms we care about, are very different among different people. So we could mean health risk, like direct toxicity or direct allergenicity. We could mean harm to what we call non-target species in the environment when they're growing, like, for example, butterflies, or how are the birds, how are these crops affecting birds or butterflies, or things that are not intended to be harmed, for example. Those are generally the risks that the regulatory system cares about in the United States, and they pretty much focus on those risks for the most part. They're not necessarily thinking about wider ecosystem risks, like, does this increase or decrease chemical use in the environment? Is this good or bad for climate change? Is this good or bad for water supplies? Is this good or bad for communities? For farming communities, organic versus conventional farming communities? Is this economically beneficial to people? So does this affect poverty? So that is just a perfect question, because what risks you care about is very much based on what you value. And in the regulatory system, so when the National Academy said that, they were focusing on direct toxicity, allergenicity, and harm to species in the environment, yeah, for the most part.
Government gets to choose the regulator or the company gets to choose the regulator. So I guess from your experience as a former regulator and someone that's in the field, how are regulators chosen, and how is it ensured that regulators are independent?
Wow, that's a fantastic question too. You guys know your stuff on the social science side. You're hitting on like all the right points here. Yeah, there is, and in fact, I did write an article a long time ago about the revolving door between industry and government agencies. And there is quite a bit of revolving door, like people, but in some ways that makes sense. So sometimes, if you've worked for the regulatory agencies, you go to industry, there's usually a couple-year prohibition on, like, you can't work on that exact topic for a while. So there's a cooling off period, if you will, where you can't, but there still is a lot of turnaround between regulators and the industry. In one way, that's a good thing, because you want the regulators to understand, what goes on in industry and vice versa. So it's a good thing, but sometimes it can lead to conflict of interest, and if not a direct conflict of interest, a bias. And so you're hitting on a really good point, and I have seen a bit of that go on. But in general, I also know a lot of solid people that have been in government all their life too. So it's a mixed bag.
And the other part of your question, I think, is a really interesting one around genetically engineered organisms, which is that our government, when we faced genetically modified organisms for the first time, we didn't create a brand new agency and say, this is the new regulatory agency for all GMOs. We have something called the Coordinated Framework for the Regulation of Biotechnology, which says our existing laws in the USDA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Food Drug Administration, those are sufficient to manage the risks of new genetically engineered organisms. And so which agency takes the lead and how they collaborate is actually often contested and uncertain. And even in the last few years, especially with genetically engineered insects, there's been a lot of uncertainty around who gets to regulate a genetically engineered insect. Is it the FDA because mosquitoes are animals and FDA is in charge of genetically engineered animals? Or is it the EPA because the genetically engineered mosquito is meant to be a kind of pesticide? And it's actually gone back and forth. We are constantly struggling to figure out how to regulate and manage new kinds of technologies that are coming on the scene, given that these laws were not written for the kinds of organisms that we're facing now. So it's a really interesting and ongoing question.
And I guess works very differently in different countries.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. There are some countries that have a biotech law where everything goes to that law, but ours is a patchwork of existing laws. And I'll just also add to, Jason was right on with everything he said, but I'll just add to it that sometimes it depends on what claim the developer of the product is making. So if you're making a disease-fighting claim with your genetically engineered mosquito, it goes to the FDA. But if you're making, like you said, a pesticide claim, a general pesticide claim, we're going to reduce the mosquito population, then it goes to the EPA. If you're going to fight dengue and Zika and malaria, it would go to the FDA, or if you're just reducing mosquitoes. So it depends on what sometimes the company says, too, and how they market their product.
Question in the back, and then I saw a group of questions here.
Fred, when you showed us the pictures of the supermarket food, I was thinking to myself, what does he mean by genetic engineering? And gosh darn it, I rose my hand twice at the 100% part. I said 100%, all of these are genetically engineered. Because I have hiked all over the world. I've been to every continent except Antarctica. I've never once bumped into a wild patch of zucchinis.
Right. Okay. So.
A full-grown watermelon, right?
Yeah.
Aren't these all genetically engineered because we have been engineering them for millennia? That humans have shaped our food more than anything. And so I wanted to have a response there.
Right.
And I'd also like if the panel would talk and inform our audience a bit more about the new National Bioengineering Labeling Standard.
Okay.
That has just been into effect.
Maybe just to get some more questions we can answer quickly. Yeah.
Should I address this?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so that's a wonderful question, and it leads to why I asked everybody what percentage of those things did they think were genetically engineered. And I think that we have such odd ideas about what is it that makes something genetically engineered, right? You have been using conventional breeding for so many thousands of years. And there's great literature these days with new genomic techniques of tracing back the ancestors of your crops. So you do find that wild patch of zucchini, and it doesn't look anything like the zucchini you had. So corn started out as a plant called teosinte that was about this big and didn't have any wrapper around it or anything like that. And it was farmers in Mexico that kept breeding it to be a different kind of plant. And the teosinte doesn't look like corn at all. But that is called conventional breeding, not genetic engineering. And I think that when I remember having somebody come up to me at a talk, and they said, well, what about those red bell peppers? Like, those must be genetically engineered, because we didn't used to have them when we were kids, right? They must have genetically engineered. And all it is that people took varieties that they found in South America and crossed them with the regular green bell peppers and came up with a different color. So when you're seeing all of this variation, and I know you see it with grapes these days, they have all these fancy names to them, and all these tomatoes, that was done by conventional breeding. And because it's conventional, or so to speak, traditional, because it's just like what the Mexican farmers did with corn, we think we have a history of it, of safe use. But I think it's all gotten confused. And that's why that's why I showed you all those slides, is that you can look at those things and they have changed so much. So the phenotype, what they look like, what they taste like, right? Super sweet corn is not necessary, could be genetic engineering or could be done by conventional breeding. So I think it's, okay, all right. So when you go to the grocery store and buy regular vegetables in the grocery store, they're not labeled. But you just brought up that next question, and I'll let one of my distinguished colleagues here answer it for you.
Yeah, so recently the Congress did pass the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Act, which turned into standards for labeling labeling some genetically engineered foods on the market. And so now if the product has foreign DNA in the final food product, so it has to come from a different species and it has to be in the final food product, then it needs to have a label on it. And so the 4 options are, one is a symbol that says, bioengineered food. The other one is derived from bioengineered ingredients. There's a text label that just says, bioengineered foods, contains bioengineered foods. But there is a 4th option, and that's a QR code. And that doesn't have to have anything that says bioengineered on it. It's just a code that you would scan to get more information about bioengineered foods. That's what allowed Congress to pass it, in full disclosure. The politics of it was that 4th option where, so if you really want to know if your food is genetically engineered for sure, make sure you scan the QR code on the final product in grocery stores. Or if you want also, and I'm not saying that, again, the risks are maybe the same as conventional products, but if you care about this issue, scan your QR codes to look to see if it is engineered and or by organic, that's USA certified organic, because that doesn't allow either gene editing or genetic engineering. So those are the 2 ways you can avoid it if that's what your value system is. Again, I'm not saying that the risk is any greater or not. I'm just saying if that's what your value system is. Does that answer your question, Chris? Okay, thank you.
I just want to add, though, if you go to, remember what I just showed you, if you go to the grocery store and you want to pick out vegetables or you want to pick out fruits, and you're thinking, I don't want to eat anything that's genetically engineered, you don't have to go and get organic vegetables or fruits, because there's no chance that any of that yet is genetically engineered.
There are some under review, so. And
We're at the end here, but maybe 2 quick questions. So green and then
That's not
pink
entirely
behind.
true.
Oh,
Just
it's,
pipette.
sorry.
Just the apples and
So
pipette.
this kind of relates to like a question I had about the history of GMOs as well. But do you feel like GMOs, because you keep talking about like big company, corporation, and I'm trying to word this question in the right way. Do you feel like GMOs have been kind of, at least with shareholders that have a place in supporting GMO, like ventures and stuff like that? Do you feel like it's been used to kind of cushion monoculture and industrialized agriculture? And do you feel like that, because I'm someone that's more interested in agroecology and how localized food systems can benefit both the ecosystem and human health.
Yeah.
So how do you feel like GMO plays a role in that intersection between industrialized ag and local food systems?
Great question.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question, and helps remind us that the issues around food are not simply just human health safety, right? They're about how we want our food systems to work. I think, what's interesting about genetic engineering is, on one hand, it's scale neutral. So you can buy seeds that are genetically engineered and only plant a small field, or you can buy 1 million seeds and plant 50 fields. And that's not the same thing as applying things like fertilizer or during irrigation, where the economies of scale really matter. And so you could imagine that we could make genetically engineered seeds for small farmers in environments where they're not doing monoculture and maybe they don't have many industrialized inputs and things like that. You could imagine that, but it hasn't really happened very much. It might, and there are some signs that there's interest in developing those kinds of minor crops for genetic engineering. But what we've seen for 20 years is mostly an emphasis on genetic engineering the major cereal crops, because those are the biggest markets. That's where the returns are going to come from. And so the question of whether genetic engineering has further pushed monoculture and industrialized agriculture is a really tough one to unpack, because it was really only applied to those crops to begin with. And so you might be able to do some sort of comparison. I don't know if your committee did that, of looking at Europe, where GMOs have not been allowed, and the United States, where they have been. Has industrialized agriculture grown more or less in those 2 different contexts? But it's a tricky question, and it's not just about the characteristic of the technology. It's the kinds of choices that we make about investment around that technology. So great question.
And there are some crops that have been developed, like in Africa, for viral-resistant cassava, and the papaya, the papaya saved the industry in Hawaii. So there have been some kind of pockets where it's fit in more of a local context. But in general, it's been on the big commodity crops. So I just wanted to add that there are some case studies of it helping smaller farmers in developing countries or in Hawaii and such. So.
And maybe just one last question there, so we can all go make choices about what we're going to eat today. Yeah, and the team will the panel will stick around. So if you want to follow up, they'll be here for a little bit. At least Jason will.
When you were going through the different slides and like 20-cent price differences between the two things, and like with the different apples that don't brown, and that is like 20 cents more expensive. I was wondering if there was a reason for that other than like it costs more to genetically engineer it and figure out that science. Is there any monetary pushes by any like governments or companies or anything that are like, hey, like pushing this idea of genetically modified foods or not pushing the idea of genetically modified foods and if that is affecting the industry at all to be pushed one way or the other?
So if I'm understanding, I'm going to move back to why I changed those numbers was just for the exercise, right?
He made those up.
Yes, I made those up. But just to get you to be thinking about what you would pay, how you value, right? How you value something that's not engineered, or how you value something that is better for the environment because it's been engineered. That's why I was choosing those. But there is some connection, right? The aqua bounty salmon, if produced at very large quantities, right? If they could be cheaper because it's more efficient, it requires less feed to get to the same size, maybe. But I don't have those numbers, so I couldn't tell you that. I don't, do you have numbers on that?
No, but I mean, he's kind of in the ballpark. A lot of public surveys, most people in the U.S. at least are willing to pay about a 20% premium for non-genetically modified foods generally. So he was kind of in the ballpark of like what people
guess.
would be willing to pay or not for one or the other. Although most people are undecided about GM foods. It depends on the benefits. It depends on trust. But there is like about 20% of the population that is going to reject them no matter what. And there's about 20% that don't care. I'm just going to buy the cheapest thing. I love technology kind of thing. So, when people say consumers are against GMOs, most of them are really not. It's really, most of us are. It's going to depend whether we trust people. It's going to depend how they're made and what the benefits are. So.
Well, thank you so much, panel, and thank you, audience, for gathering today. And we have the great luck to have this whole team here, and we're really one of the few places that